The former lead prosecutor in Larry Hoover's federal case, reacting this afternoon with disappointment, telling us there are just some offenders and crimes that are not deserving of clemency, and Hoover falls in that category. But this afternoon, President Trump disagreeing, commuting Hoover's 6 life sentences on federal convictions to time served.
Larry Hoover had been forgotten about by President Obama, left to rot the Supermax, the ADX. But would the old man die in a prison cell in the mountains of Colorado? With Kanye West, Drake, and other celebrities, Larry Hoover's plea for freedom from the inhumane conditions would reach the ears of the one person who could really help him. Alice Johnson, a former federal prisoner who once had a life sentence. Trump would commute her sentence, grant her a pardon, and make her his Pardon Czar. Alice, will she free more people than Harriet Tubman? It's been said in circles at her 70th birthday party that she made just that statement. And she decided that she would start with Larry Hoover. With Alice behind him, President Trump decided that the old man had had enough and deserved to get out of the ADX. And with a swipe of a pen, he would grant clemency to the once notorious gang leader. Larry Hoover was born on November 30th, 1950 in Jackson, Mississippi. But his family would move to Chicago, Illinois when he was just 4 years old. Growing up on the South Side, Hoover was exposed early to the harsh realities of street life, poverty, violence, and limited opportunity. Larry Hoover was raised on the South Side of Chicago and reported at the time probation did his PSR that he had pleasant memories of his childhood and adolescence. Despite his relatively stable upbringing, Hoover would join the Black Peace Stone Nation during his adolescence in the 1960s, as he reported to the probation department at paragraph 81. By his own admission, Hoover was expelled from Francis Parker High School after being involved in a shooting in front of the principal's office. By the late 1960s or early 70s, Hoover had become the leader of the Supreme Gangsters. On the night of February 26, 1973, Andrew Howard, a gang member under Hoover's command, would shoot a young man named Young in the head 6 times and dump his body in an alley. Approximately 90 minutes after the murder, Hoover would call another meeting and reported that he had gotten one of the guys that they was after, and he wanted the other 2 killed also before the week was out. Another one of Hoover's targets would be Joshua Shaw. He too was murdered several months later in September 1973. The police were locked in, and they knew that they had to eliminate the chief and believed by doing so that it would change the direction of Chicago. Even the cops were plotting, and some were lawless. Larry had become their target, and one way or the other, he was going. Beginning in the early 1970s and for many years after, the Gangster Disciples sold cocaine in Chicago, Illinois, and the surrounding area. The GDs would use violence when necessary to protect its territory from incursions by rival gangs. But this was the street life: guns, drugs, and gangs. They all go hand in hand, and Chicago was becoming the Wild West in the 1970s. Young dudes would provide security for the higher-ups by packing pipes that were ready to go off at any given moment. For these young dudes, Larry was their king or their chief. The South Side of Chicago has long been one of the most impoverished and crime-affected areas of the city. In the 50s and 60s, when Hoover was growing up there, it was undergoing significant demographic and economic changes. Factory closures, white flight, and disinvestment created a tough environment for young black residents. These conditions contribute to the rise of gangs, which often filled the void left by absent social and economic infrastructure. As jobs disappeared, so did opportunities. Young men increasingly shut out of the legitimate economy would turn to the drug trade for income. Violent street gangs like the Gangster Disciples, Black Disciples, and Vice Lords began consolidating power. Live by the gun, die by the gun. Violence was rising, but no one was prepared for what was to come in Chicago. The 1980s brought a devastating wave of violence across Englewood, fueled by the crack cocaine epidemic, the gang life, easy access to high-powered firearms as well. Englewood became a major battleground between rival gangs, particularly the Gangster Disciples and the Black Disciples. These groups weren't just street corner operations. They were organized, deadly at times, and embedded in the neighborhood. Children were recruited as lookouts and runners for drug corners. Shootings became daily occurrences, often involving innocent bystanders. Drive-by shootings became a signature method of retaliation, and bodies dropping mattered to few. Englewood's school dropout rates skyrocketed, and social services would decline. Police scanners in the late 80s frequently buzzed with shots fired, calls from 63rd and Halsted, Ashland, and Normal. Families had to sleep on the floor to avoid stray bullets. Chicago was becoming a war zone. Would it ever stop? By the 1990s, Englewood was considered ground zero for urban violence in Chicago. Several high-profile tragedies brought national attention. In 1994, Chicago saw nearly 1,000 homicides, and many occurred in Englewood and nearby neighborhoods. Children were often caught in the crossfire, especially during gang wars. Infant and child homicides would shock the conscience of the city. Bullets flying through windows, parks, and porches. Murder was simply becoming a way of life. Here, life had very little meaning for so many. Age did not matter when the ops had beef. On the morning of October 13, 1992, Englewood woke up to another day of poverty, boarded up buildings, and tension. In the South Side neighborhood, violence was a part of life. Shootings happened so often that residents learned to duck instinctively at the sound of backfire. But nothing prepared the community for what was about to happen that morning. 7-year-old Dantrell Davis was holding his mother's hand, walking to elementary school just 3 blocks from the Cabrini Green housing projects where they lived. It was a walk he had taken many times, but this day would end in tragedy. From a nearby building, a gang member opened fire, aiming for a rival. Instead, the bullet struck Dantrell in the head, killing him instantly. The shooter never meant to hit a child, but that didn't matter. The community was shattered, and Dantrell's mother destroyed. Dantrell's death became national news. He was one of many children lost to senseless gun violence in Chicago, but this case touched a nerve. His face was on the front page of the Chicago Tribune, under the headline, "When Will It Stop?" In the days that followed, the city erupted in grief and outrage. Parents would march. Pastors held vigils. And then Mayor Richard M. Daley promised increased patrols and police flooded the area. But the deeper issues, poverty, disinvestment, and the proliferation of gangs would remain. Englewood itself, though, was not just defined by this tragedy. In the wake of Dantrell's death, grassroots efforts began to take root. Local women would form parent patrols to walk kids to school safely. Community organizations like Imagine Englewood and Teamwork Englewood began pushing for youth programs, job training, and mentorship. But would it help? Still, the violence would persist. In the 2000s, Englewood saw some of the highest homicide rates in Chicago. In 2016, the city recorded 762 murders, with Englewood among the hardest hit neighborhoods. Shootings happened in broad daylight. Kids wore bulletproof backpacks. Whole blocks became war zones. But inside that darkness, small lights kept burning. Young lives taken, and the violence never stops. On October 13, 2016, in Englewood, a sad story would repeat itself. 1-year-old Dejan Irving was sitting in a car seat when gunmen would open fire on the vehicle. His mother was in the front seat with her boyfriend, the intended target. A bullet struck baby Dejan in the chest. He was rushed to the hospital, but it was far too late. He was pronounced dead just hours after the shooting. The violence was part of a larger pattern of gang retaliation that had plagued Englewood and surrounding South Side neighborhoods. The community mourned. Local pastors and activists, including Father Michael Fledger and members of the group Mothers Against Senseless Killings, held rallies. There were balloons, stuffed animals, and angry speeches, something we have all seen in so many urban neighborhoods across the country. And people would ask, how many more babies have to die? No one felt safe, not even children in car seats. Could the chief help stop the violence from a prison cell? Advocates for years have claimed he could help. Larry Hoover was a young man who wanted power, perhaps fame, and plenty of money. With leadership qualities, he was working his hand and creating an organization where people would listen to him and allow him to rule over them. And now that he had the power, it was only a matter of time before Larry would find himself in a position where he would be housed in a concrete mausoleum. He would find himself by himself, literally. In the late 60s, Larry Hoover and David Barksdale, the leaders of 2 Chicago street gangs, would merge their gangs to form the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, which name was later shortened to Gangster Disciples. Hoover and Barksdale ruled the unified gang as King Larry and King David. But Barksdale's shared reign ended when he was killed soon after the gangs would merge. The police would round Larry and his people up. It was just the local police, not the feds, but it was Larry's turn. He would go to trial facing life in prison, and nothing could help him. Following his murder conviction, Hoover would remain in the Illinois Department of Corrections from February 1974 until 1995. He was what people would call a shot caller. Some people are faking, but Larry, he seemed to be the real deal. with a life sentence, and from behind bars, the chief would call the shots. Under Hoover's leadership, the gang rose to prominence, controlling a large part of the street-level drug trafficking in the Chicago area. At its height, in the early 1990s, the gang's drug sales brought in about $100 million per year. In the 1980s, Hoover jettisoned the old nomenclature of the gang's top leaders in favor of a more modern, corporate gang. He would call himself the chairman of the board and formed his closest allies into two board of directors, an incarcerated board for the leaders in prison and an unincarcerated board for the leaders on the outside. The directors oversaw all of the gang's operations. Below the directors were the governors, who were charged with running narcotic sales in specified areas throughout Chicago and its suburbs. A governor typically had about 1,000 gang members, called foot soldiers, working under him. A governor could control this many gang members because he had two more layers of leaders beneath him. The regents, who controlled smaller areas within a governor's territory, and coordinators, who controlled smaller areas within a regent's territory. In 1990, Hoover would appoint Gregory Shell, who was already a member of the unincarcerated board, to second in command. Charged with controlling the gang's activities on the outside, but Hoover was in prison. The Gangster Disciples specialized in street-level, low-price sales of small quantities of drugs. This presented two problems for the gang's leaders. The gang needed to control territory in which it could make sales, and needed to organize the actions of and collect the proceeds from the thousands of foot soldiers carrying on the day-to-day sales. The gang conducted census revealed that it had anywhere from 6,000 to 30,000 members selling drugs. The coordinators, regents, and governors had to control which foot soldier sold where to ensure that the gang did not compete for sales against itself. If there was more demand in an area, then the Gangster Disciples had foot soldiers to supply. The gang permitted dealers unaffiliated with a gang called Neutrons to sell their wares so long as they paid a tax to the Gangster Disciples. But the Gangster Disciples violently suppressed any rival gang's attempt to sell in Gangster Disciple territory. In order to funnel proceeds from the enormous number of small sales to the gang's leaders, Hoover decided to charge each gang member certain dues, called the count or the weekly. This was in effect a tax or a franchise fee for doing business as a Gangster Disciple, similar to the tax levied on the Neutrons. The governors were responsible for getting the weekly into the directors, and governors who owed back taxes were likely to find themselves the unwilling recipients of a beating. Hoover also demonstrated his vision and organizational flair by forming a political action committee for the gang called 21st Century Vote and imposing another tax on gang members called the Political, some of the revenue from which was funneled into the PAC. The gang also sponsored music concerts with mandatory attendance for gang members and used the concerts to launder drug money. In 1993, apparently dissatisfied with his profits as the chairman, Hoover would develop a scheme called One Day a Week, or Nation Dope. One day each week, everyone selling within the gang's territory had to sell drugs for Larry Hoover himself. Hoover estimated that this would net him $200,000 to $300,000 each week. He thought there might be some resistance to Nation Dope, so he instructed the directors to put the word out that anyone refusing to sell Nation Dope would be shot. Hoover's analysis was simple. One day a week ain't much to ask for your life. Hoover knew that this phone call in prison could be monitored, so whenever a director began to discuss business matters on the phone, Hoover would cut him off and told him to come to the prison to see him in person. So the directors had to go to whichever prison Hoover was currently in to receive their instructions. When Hoover was eventually transferred to Illinois' Vienna facility, traveling became a hardship because Vienna is located in the southern tip of the state, about a 6-hour drive from Chicago. But the directors regularly made this trip, and Hoover had a stream of visitors, as he ordered. In the fall of 1993, the government would get a court order permitting it to place a transmitter in the visitor badge given to the gang leaders who came to see Hoover. The government was thus able to monitor the conversations of the gang's inner leadership for 6 weeks until the transmitter was discovered. And now the feds were locked in. And on August 31st, 1995, Larry Hoover's reign was coming to a close when a federal grand jury returned 3 separate indictments charging Hoover and 38 other Gangster Disciples with a conspiracy to sell drugs, including crack and related offenses. Starting on March 19, 1997, a jury of Larry's so-called peers would be tasked with deciding his fate, and his second-in-command, Gregory Shell, and 4 other gang leaders. On May 9, 1997, they would seal his fate. The jury found Hoover and his co-defendants guilty on all charges. The court would ultimately find that Larry from prison would order his disciples to purchase powder cocaine, crack cocaine, heroin, and marijuana from suppliers, who dealt directly with Larry Hoover and at his direction, the board members. The court also found that recorded conversations between Hoover and other gang leaders established the existence of a plan requiring GDs to sell nation dope, meaning drugs provided directly from the gang 1 day per week. In taped conversations that the feds had seized, Larry Hoover admitted that 1 day's drug profits for the entire gang easily totaled over $300,000, which would translate to approximately 4.5 kilos or bricks of crack cocaine being sold on a daily basis. At that rate, the GDs were estimated to have grossed $109 million annually from the sale of narcotics. For Larry, this meant life, and not life as most people knew it in the feds. As the sentencing hearing came to a close, the federal judge would bang his gavel and do what he came to do. He would send the chief to prison for the rest of his life. Larry was too dangerous to be in population, according to the government, and the feds had a place for him. The ADX Supermax. Calling shots from here would be difficult, and this is what the feds intended. For a quarter of a century, Larry Hoover had been incarcerated in the country's most draconian Supermax prison, ADX Florence, located in Florence, Colorado. He would spend 23 hours a day in a concrete cell, no larger than a parking space. For over 2 decades, he had virtually no contact with the outside world. He was quite literally buried alive. Absent an opportunity for resentencing, Mr. Hoover would die at ADX Florence without ever having embraced his grandchildren. But Alice Johnson and President Trump were coming. On his first term, Trump had passed the First Step Act, which opened the door for numerous African-American men and women to get a second chance at life. It was the biggest sentencing reform package ever passed in the history of the country. This would allow people like Larry Hoover to argue to the court he was a changed man and should be given a second chance at life. His lawyers would file those motions and argue that Larry Hoover, who graces the cover of the government's opposition papers, had died long ago, notwithstanding the government's unfounded claim that he harbors a desire to reclaim his title as the king of the Gangster Disciples, an enterprise that bears little resemblance to the organization he built in the 1970s. The Larry Hoover of today is not as glamorous as the government would have the world believe. He is an ailing old man who humbly accepts responsibility for his past and experiences deep remorse for the harm he has caused. Larry's life would be outlined in court pleadings. Prisoners at ADX spend 23 hours per day in concrete cells measuring 7 by 12 feet. Prisoners eat, sleep, and defecate in this confined space. ADX's inhabitants spend their days in cells the size of a parking space. During the hour that prisoners spend outside their cells each day, they are placed in a recreational cage. Prisoners experience little to no human interaction, often limited to guards shackling the prisoner and transforming him to and from the recreational cage. Despite these conditions, Larry found a way to stay mentally strong. Many others never do. Some prisoners, like John Powers, under similar conditions at the ADX, have cut their fingers off, bit them off, removed their scrotums and other wild shit. But Larry, he would somehow get through it. Hold on, Larry. Trump is coming. The compassionate release motion that he had filed would be pending for far too long with no decision. And on May 28, 2025, Donald Trump, with the swipe of a pen, would make sure that Larry Hoover would get out of the ADX. Hoover was granted clemency, but he wasn't the only person to be granted clemency on that day. Garnett Gilbert Smith, also known as Mr. Big, was a prominent drug kingpin from Baltimore, Maryland. He operated a significant drug trafficking organization that extended from Baltimore to California. In 2013, Smith was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for conspiring to distribute and possess with intent to distribute cocaine. He, along with many others, found their freedom, and it is expected that thousands and thousands more will also find a second chance. But would Larry go free? Larry Hoover would be transferred to the state of Illinois, where he has over 100 years left to serve on his state sentence. But with calls from advocates, including Alice Johnson, and political figures behind him, as well as celebrities, will Illinois' governor release him? And if not, will he win in 2026? Or will the Republicans take over? And with the influence of Trump, will the new governor set Larry free? Stay tuned and expect it to happen.